All right, this is Daf Yomi in motion, number 808. Today we're going to learn Daf Peiches in Metzia. HaTevel Mischiav Meiser. The different shittas about when Tevel is Mischiav Meiser. More begins Hey Zayin on my base. We're just speaking about how, from the drosha of Kinafshecha, in the pasuk in Devarim, it says, "Ki savo bekerem re'echa." When a person will come, a poyel will become to the field of his friend and will be working there. V'yochalta anovim kinafshecha, and he is allowed to eat the anovim as he's picking them off. Savecha, as much as he wants as he's working. The el kelecha lo siten, but you shouldn't put them into his kelim to take home. And the darshan that in the end we didn't use that pasuk to teach us that the poil is allowed to eat for all types of crops, but it was just for the halacha. One of the halachas was kinefesh shel balabayas, just as the nefesh of the balabayas, that when he will be if he would eat at that stage, which is the Gemar Malacha, when it's just being harvested, he would not. It's like he would not have to take meiser. So too the payel, also if he's picking and harvesting at that stage, he doesn't have to take meiser, because even though we might have thought that the drasha we were trying to make was, even though that we might have thought that he would have to take meiser because he's eating this produce as part of his wage. Because he's allowed to eat while he's working, and we know that mekach is considered like a gemar malacha in order to mechayev meiser. So we might think that for a payil who has the right to be eating the produce as he's harvesting it, that it would be like mekach, and it would be gemar malacha to mechayev him in meiser. The pasuk comes to tell us, no, just as the balabayas wouldn't be chayav meiser, the payil who's working will also not be chayav meiser. So on that, the Gemara on the bottom line of Pei Zayin Amid Beis said, Omer Rabbi Yonai. Now we're talking about when the chiyuv meiser comes to produce. Omer Rabbi Yonai, Ein HaTevel Mischayev b'meiser. Tevel isn't Mischayev b'meiser ad sheyir pnei abayis, until, according to Rabbi Yonai's shita is that there's no chiyuv until the produce comes and sees the main entrance to the house, and then there's a chiyuv to meiser the produce. Shnei, because we have a pasuk says be'arti hakayish min habayis. We're talking here about the chiyuv of being meiser produce and the zmanim of bir meisros, and he was on the 4th and the 7th year. So he was ba'arti hakadosh min habayis, and from min habayis, so Rabbi Yonai learns out that that's when there was a chiyuv to meiser it, because from there. Rabbi Yochanan Omar afilu chotzer kovas. Not only the bias, the front of the house is that koveya, but also if it just comes to the chotzer of the house, that's enough to be koveya. Shneimar, as it says v'ochlu b'sharecha v'saveu, that they ate. It was referring to when the Levim and the Almonos and the Yisayimim, and they would all come to take the different maisrais. They would come b'sharecha and they would eat. So it's mashma from there that even in the Chatzer, there was already a chiyuv of meiser. That's what Rabbi Yochanan learned from. Filu b'chatzer kovas. Shnema, like we just read. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan, Nami Haksiv Min Abayis. What does he do with the pasuk Min Abayis? Which is mashma that also you have to take into account that the chiyuv was mashma that the chiyuv meiser came when it came to the front of the house, when the produce came to the front of the house. Rabbi Yochanan would answer, Omar loch, chotzer dumia debayis. That the chotzer that was being referred to, why does it say bias? Because the chotzer that Rabbi Yochanan is saying is the koveya, it has to be similar to the bias, just as the bias is mishmeris. So too the chutzner has to be an enclosed chutzner. It's mishmeris. More says, Omar lo chutzner dumi the bias, ma bias hamishtamer, af chutzner hamishtameris. The chutzner has to be an enclosure in order to be koveya l'maiser. What is Rabbi Yonai, who says that the bias is kovas for maiser? What does he do with the pasuk, which speaks about how the maestros will be giving out at the shah, at the gate? Rabbi Yonai nami haksiv b'sharecha. Rabbi Yonai would explain that b'sharecha hahumi boyele d'mayel le derech shah lafuki derech gagos v'kar pifos. That means that even though the kavas is the front of the house, but in order for the front of the house to be koveya, it has to come through the front yard, the derech of the front yard. And lafuke, they can't bring it to the front door by way of over the gag, or you can't bring it into the house through the roof or through the karfifos, other types of porch, through the porch. When bringing it into the house, which is kovas, it has to come straight through from the front gate. Below, right? Practically Meisiv, Rabbi Chanina Hoizah. He's quoting the brisa that we had before when we learned Kinafshecha, just as the Baal Abayis, when he would eat just after the Gemar Malacha, before it came to the chiyuv of meiser, he doesn't have to take meiser. So to the poil, if he's working and the produce is at that stage, he's allowed to eat it. We learned. So k'nafshecha kach nafshe shel poil. We learned so too the poil will have the same din as the owner. Ma nafshecha oichel v'poter. If the owner would eat it, he'd be poter. He wouldn't be eating tevel. He wouldn't have had a chiyuv meiser. So af nafsho shel poil oichel v'poter. We learned. So, and the whole diuk was the reason why we needed a pasuk to tell us that a poil would be allowed to eat, because we might think that since he's eating as part of his wage, that it's like mekach, and mekach is like gemar malacha to be a koveya for meiser, and we'd be learning. We would have a pasuk telling us that a poil would not have a chiyuv meiser, but a real lokeach, someone who would buy produce, even if it was before the gemar malach, if it was just from the field stage, but if he's buying it, that would be kovas, and he would have a chiyuv meiser. Ha lokeach chayev. And that was what we were learning from that brisa. And it's this is the kasha, because it's kasha on both Rabbi Yoni and Rabbi Yochanan, because where do we see that the lokeach would be chayev? Even before it reached the pnei bayis, or even before it reached the chatzir, the chatzir, even in the field. And that's what the Gemara is asking. My love besoda, even in the field, isn't the implication that any time it's being sold, it's going to already be chayev? If the etzem mekach is chayev the meiser, and that's the kash on Rabbi Yonah and Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rav Papa, hocha no. What are we dealing with? We're talking about that it's a tree, true, which is outside of the chatzar, but the branches are chatzar and askinin. And then when the person picks it off, he was already in the chatzar. And that's why there was a chiyuv, according to Rabbi Yochanan. The Manda Omer, what about the Manda Omer that Rabbi Yonai, that you need the pnei bayis? What was the case then referring to? Lamanda Omar Lebias, meaning the tree was hanging over into the chutzner, into the front chutzner of which was in front of the house. So even according to Rabbi Yonai, when it was picked off, it was immediately Pnei Abayis and Chayev. There was a Chiyuv Meiser. Right. So that was the case where the owner, that there was already a Chiyuv Meiser. So that's why we have the pasuk telling us that if he's a payil, then he will be potter. And we're understanding at this point that if he's the balabais and he picks it off at that stage, he will be potter. But if he was a lokeach picking it from that stage, we're showing that we're not talking about in the fields, we're talking about in front of the house, that's where the lokeach will be chayav. So it's not a kasha on either Rabbi Yonah or Rabbi Yochanan, because we're talking about in the places that they were referring to as being the kovas from Isa. For back to the Gemara though, that was Rabbi Papa. So, in fact, more if that's where we're referring to, we're talking about that the tree is outside of the chutzner, but it's hanging into the chutzner in front of the house. So then, why are we saying then that the balabais would be potter? He should then be chayav immediately. In kain balabais nami michayav. Why were we implying that the balabais would be potter, just as the balabais is potter, the poil will also be potter? If we're talking about, at least according to Rabbi Yonai, in front of the house, as soon as it would be picked off, the balabais would also be chayav. Yochi balabais nami nichayav. And for the Gemara, no, the reason why balabais wouldn't be chayav in that case, balabais eina b'te'enoso, lokeach eina b'mekcho, that the balabais doesn't, even though it is hanging, it's a branch which is, the whole tree is outside of the chutzner, but the branch is hanging over into his chutzner. The balabais doesn't really care about the branch hanging into his chutzner. He cares more about, it might be his tree, he cares more about the ikar tree. The tree is planted outside of the chutzner. That's what he focuses on. He doesn't focus so much on the fact that one branch with some fruit is hanging into his chutzner. So therefore, it's not considered right. That's not considered in front of in the chutzner going into his house. So that for the balabais wouldn't be machayev him, meiser. But the lokeach, when he would buy it, he focuses on what he's buying. He doesn't care where the whole tree is. If he's buying fruits from that branch, that's what he focuses on, and then he would have a chiyuv in that case. Lokeach eina b'mekcho. Even though that it's not his house, so what does he care? The pnei abayis is not his pnei of his house. So, but anyway, I guess they're learning that the pnei abayis of the owner when he's selling produce, so the lokeach would be chayev. Lokeach the lokeach midaraisa mimechayev. Where do we see that a lokeach who would buy produce of HaTevel would then be chayev meiser? Why are we asking this? Because that we need a pasuk to tell us that if it's a payil who is working, that he won't be chayev. We don't think that it'll be like a mekach when he's payil and he's allowed to eat the produce. That we would need a pasuk to say that he's potter. Where do we see that a lokeach dirais is chayev for meiser to take meiser anyway? Tanya, we learn in the Brisa, Mimnei ma chorbu chanuyos shel beis chino shlosh shanim kaidem Yerushalayim. Where do we know that the chanuyos of this place, beis chino, were destroyed 3 years before Yerushalayim was destroyed? Mipnei sha'amido divreihem al divrei Torah, because they were made talui the words of the Chazal on the words of Torah, meaning they only held by the written Torah, and they didn't hold of the Gezeres D'Rabbanan. Sha'ayu Omen, they used to say, and so when they darshan the Torah, this is the way they darshaned it. They darshan, it says, Aser Taser. Pasuk says, there's two psukim right next to each other. One says the Meiser should be taken. And the next pasuk after it says, the whole pasuk says you should Meiser your Tavua, Zarecha, which comes from your field every year. Then the next pasuk after it says, V'yochalta lifnei Hashem Elokecha. It's referring to the Meiser Sheni. And you should eat it. Eat the Meiser that you took. So the way they darshan v'lo moicher, v'ochalta v'lo moicher, meaning you only have to take Meiser in order. They darshan according to Yeraisa. You only have to take Meiser in order to be able to eat the produce. V'lo moicher, but not in order to be able to sell it. That you can. There's mashma that there's no real chiyuv. Meiser when it's in order to sell it. I guess they're learning also if someone would be buying it that there would be no chiyuv. So and then it goes on. The pasuk says, from the first pasuk it says, like we said, Aser Taser Eskol Tevuas Zarecha. All of Tevuah you should Meiser all of Tevuas Zarecha. So Tevuas Zarecha they darshan v'lo lokeach. So they learn that the only one who has to take Meiser is the one whose produce it was, but not one who bought the produce. He doesn't have to take Meiser. So we see from that deraisa there's no chiyuv on a lokeach to take Meiser. More answers. True, there's no chiyuv deraisa for a lokeach to take Meiser, but it's a derabanan that a lokeach should take Meiser. And the pasuk of nafshecha that we saw, that implied nafshecha, that the poil should be like the balabais, and he has a patur that he's allowed to eat this produce without taking meiser mashma, and he's not considered a lokeach. That's only that which implies that the lokeach has a chiyuv to take meiser. That's an asmachta ba'alma eladu rabbanan b'kra asmachta ba'alma. Just as the Rabbanan said, it's the Rabbanan that a lokeach should take Meiser. That's their smachta, a support from the Torah, which implies that what their gezerah was, which implies their gezerah. Because from that, like diuk, we see that the lokeach should be taking Meiser, and that's where they were gezer, that a lokeach should take Meiser. So that's an asmachta, but diraisa, what do we learn from kenafshecha? What is the pasuk kenafshecha come to teach us? What hilchasad, what halachas are coming from it? Ela kenafshecha l'may asa. What's it coming? What does the Torah come to teach us with that? The Kedatan, like we learn in the Brisa, kenafshecha ma nafshecha im chasamta pata. That if the balabais would be muzzle himself while he's working on his own field, there wouldn't be any lab of lo sachsoim shor b'disho, if he himself would muzzle himself and not allow himself to eat. So af poil im chasam to potter. So we learn from there, if the poil was his mouth was closed up when he's working, there wouldn't be any lab of lo sachsom shor b'disho. That's what that's learned from, but true, and that's why we need the pasuk. The reason that we have the pasuk is for this, and the drosha that the lokeach would be chayav meiser. Just the mekach alone would be a kavas meiser. That's a gzera d'Rabbanan. In fact, the Gemara Meisiv Marzutra Ezeu Garnan l'maisrois. Garnan is the lashon of the malacha, the Gemara malacha by Tavua, standing stalks in a field, and they use it. Since it was a pasuk referring to the Gemara Malacha of wheat, they use it all over to refer to the Gemara Malacha of any crop. So, Eze Garinan Lemaisos, what are the different Gemara Malachas which will be Koveya Meiser, Bekishuyim, Vidluyim, Mishapiksu, for pumpkins and gourds. That's when Piksu, when a certain flour dries up and falls off the top of them. So Mishapiksu is mashma from that at that stage it's automatically considered the Gemar Malacha and it'll be a Chiyuv Meiser. And it's not defining where it is when it falls off. It's mashma. It doesn't matter where it falls off, even if it fell off in the field. And that's what the Gemara is. That's the kasha, because kasha and Rabbi Yonah and Rabbi Yochanan, who said each one said that Chiyuv Meiser was dependent on where it is, where it comes to. Rabbi Yochanan into the Chatzir and Rabbi Yonah bifnei abayis. For Omer Rabbi Yasi, mishinot al pikes shalhem. There's a definition, meaning when the flower falls off the top of the pumpkin. So my love, mishapiksu afilu b'sada, because it's not telling us where, just as whenever that happens, that's the time, that's the Gemara, that's the kalvas l'maiser. And for the Gemara, that's the kasha on those two madromim. Lo, mishapiksu b'bayis. No, we're talking about really, it has to still come to Pnei Bayis, and it has to have fallen off and then come to the Pnei Bayis. Meaning, if it would just come to the Pnei Bayis without having the flower having fallen off, it wouldn't be kovas. Even the Pnei Bayis for Rabbi Yonah wouldn't have been kovas for Meiser. The Gemara says, if that's what we're supposed to be learning, ihachi mishapiksu, instead of having the Brisa having said, whenever the flower falls off, that's the kovas l'maiser for the pumpkins, it should have said ad sheyifkisu miboile. Meaning, if we're still holding by Rabbi Yonah, according to Rabbi Yonah, that he still has to come to the Pnei Bayis. So what is this flower falling off? Means that the flower has to, in order for the Pnei Bayis to be kovas maiser, the flower had to have fallen off already. Meaning, it should have said ad sheyifksu. Then the bias, Pnei Bayis, will be kovas the maiser, according to Rabbi Yonah. So why did it say as soon as the flower falls off, it's mashma? It doesn't matter where it is. More says that if we had learned like that, ad sheyifkisu, so itana ad sheyifkisu, I would have thought ad shegomar lipkis the pikusayu. I would have thought until the end of it's falling off, that it will only become kovas lemaiser when it's all completely, when the whole flower completely fell off. And if we had learned ad sheyipkasu. So that's why I didn't learn that way, because that's not the halacha. The halacha is just from when it begins falling off. That's enough for Rabbi Yonan, that if it should then come to Pnei Bayis, it'll be kovas lemaiser. So Kamash Malan, Mishayipkasu Mechi Itchule Pikusayu. As soon as it starts falling off, and so therefore we're Miyashiv, Rabbi Yonai, and we don't have a kasha that it's that the kovas for Meiser is not dependent on Pnei Bayis or Bechotzer. In fact, the Gemara Meisiv Marzutra Breda Rab Nachman Gorinai Lemaiser L'chayev Olav Mishum Tevel, that the Iker when Tevel will be chayev Meiser. Mishitigmar Melachtan is when the Melach is finished. And when this is a brisa, ve'ezeu Gemar Melachtan, and what is the Gemar Melachtan of different crops? Meleches is saying general for everything. Meleches Hakinoson, the gathering, the gathering of the produce in a pile, preparing it to bring it in. This Hakinosan means even in the field. So my love, Hakinosan afilu b'sada. So therefore we have a kasha from Rabbi Yonah and Rabbi Yochanan. Shitas, and for the Gemara law, we don't mean that's not. We don't mean Hakinosan, just gathering them, the isuf of them, getting them ready to bring them in. We mean Haknisosan, the bringing them into the house. Haknisosan the bias. That's what we mean. We mean actual bringing it into the house. That's the Gemara Malacha according to this. Zehu Gemara Malachtan. Right. So again, we don't have a kasha. Or we could say differently, we could say, Ibois Ema, that on all of these, It was when Rabbi Yonai said that we need Pnei Abayis, B'zeisim v'anovim. That's only by Zeisim v'anovim when the person wants to eat them as they are, and not to squeeze the wine out of them or the olive oil out of them, but rather if they want to eat them where they are, then they're considered on the same level like Tavua, and then just as Tavua says the Gorno, that it has that will be the Gemar Malacha. So Tavua it's Gorno, it's gathering, it's Isuf, could be just in the field, and that could be when it's Koveya for Meiser, Tavua. So the Gemara says, so some says that it could be that true for Tavua of the field, that it is, the Kvas for Meiser is out in the field, the Isuf, just gathering it into a pile, because it says the Gorno. And it could be that, however, Rabbi Yonai said his din, the Pnei Abayis, in regards to the Zeisim and Anavim, when a person would want to eat those as they are in the field, that it's not Shaykh Goren, because Goren, in the Tavua, you can't eat Tavua until it's processed. So that's why first you have an Isuf, and then it's brought in and used and ground down and made into flour. But the Zaitim and Anavim, so the understanding here is that they can be eaten as they are, so there's no Goranan, and therefore, it says, Delo b'nei Goran, Ninu. So then that's why the only Koveya, the other thing we can understand, that, and they have to have a Gemar Malacha, because they have the din of Tavua when they're being eaten like this. And so then the only way we could understand that they would then be time period when they would become chayiv, which would be equivalent to their garnan, would be the Pnei Abayis, according to Rabbi Yonai. So maybe therefore, that's what he meant. We need Pnei Abayis for those types of produce that can be eaten as they are and don't need any other processing, like grapes and olives. About chitin v'sayrin garin behedik sieve. It says in the pasuk Bay. It says, but there's a garin. There's a gathering in the fields, which is their gemar malacha, which is their kavas l'maisa. Ashgachan. It's all right. Period. So that's another way of learning Rabbi Yonai, even in light of those psukim that we saw. Rabbi he had a brisa that said that the gemar malacha was out in the fields. So he could agree with that. By grains, but not by olives and grapes. Like the Gemara, Ashkachan Adam b'mechuber v'shor b'talush. He's found already. We saw in our Mishnah that the Adam is allowed as he's harvesting. He's taking from mechuber and he's being tailish them. He can then eat them, and it's mutter. The owner is not supposed to stop him. And also by shor b'disho, for grains, and when the produce that the shore is working with is allowed to eat them when they're talosh, detached. But where do we see an odam b'talosh minala? Where do we see that in odam? Because the Mishnah also states that an odam b'talosh, when as long as it's before the stage where it's chayav meiser, he's allowed to eat from them also. Where do we see it? More says kal v'chomer mishor. We learn from a kal v'chomer mishor. If shore is allowed to eat talush, he's not allowed to eat mechuber. Rashi says it doesn't mean he's not allowed. It means we don't have a specific limud that he's allowed to eat from mechuber. Nevertheless, we do have a direct limud that the shore is allowed to eat from grain produce that's detached. So then we'll say that an adam that we know is allowed to eat from mechuber because we just learned it, from Koma and from Chermesh. So an Adam she'oichel b'mechuber, and Odin she'oichel b'tolush, shouldn't it be that he should be allowed to eat from tolush, just as a shore can? The Gemara says, no, he's not necessarily have a pircha to that kavachomer, b'mal shosh shechein ato mitzava al chasimoso. Tomar be'odam she'iato mitzava al chasimoso. No, maybe the reason why a shore is able to eat talush, which is maybe that's more being more lenient, is because we have a direct tzivui not to muzzle a shor b'disho. but we don't have that type of a tzivui not to muzzle an adam when it's working. So maybe since we see that we're more strict with this shore, with the animal, maybe that's why we allow it to eat from the talush. But since man that we don't have that chiyuv not to muzzle him, maybe he wouldn't be allowed to eat from tali and only from a chuber. Well, let's say that a person should also be, we should have an iser lo sach of a person when they're working, and we should learn it from a kavachomer from the shore. Ma shore she'iyato mitzaveh la'achioso. Shore, there's no obligation to allow him. There's no chiyuv to help the shore live in all its ways, but we're not supposed to muzzle it. But in Odom it says, you're supposed to help your brother live. In Odom that you're not supposed to muzzle him when he's working. We should know it's therefore we should know that the law of those sachsum applies to a man, and therefore we should say that that should allow us. That should be the limud of a person. A poyel should be able to eat from talush. More says no. True, but we can't learn that. We can't apply those sachsum to a man because we have a mefurish pasuk that tells us that it doesn't apply. Because we said Omar Kra kinafshecha, like we learned before. Kinafsho shel poyel. All right, we learned that just as the nafsho of the Baal Bayis, if he would muzzle himself and eat, there would be no lab of lo sachsoim. So too, kinafsho, that a poyel working for a Baal Bayis, if he was muzzled, there wouldn't be any lab of lo sachsoim. Kinafsho shel poyel ma nafshecha im chasamta, that there would be potter. So a poyel im chasamta potter. So therefore, we can't say that the poyel is going to have it'll be applied lo sachsom to the poyel to teach us that for sure that a poyel will be allowed to eat from talush. So then where do we know that an adam is allowed to eat from talush? Ela adam b'talush min olam. Omar Kra, the pasuk says, kama beis pami. Pasuk said, legabi in dvarim. Kisavo ba'kamas re'echa, when a person will be a worker and he'll come and work in the field, Kotafta mulilos biyodecha, and he wants to eat, take in his hand and eat as he's working. He's allowed to. V'chermesh lo sonif al komas re'echo, but he shouldn't start cutting it down in big quantities and taking it for himself. So from this pasuk it says koma beis pamim. And we know one of them is to teach us that a poyel is allowed to eat mechuber. Im eno inin le'odam b'mechuber, because we only needed one, the other one we don't need. So then use that other comma to teach us that an adam is allowed to eat talush. Rabbi Ami Omar, right? So that's the limud of where we know that an adam b'talush is allowed to eat talush when he's working with talush before it reaches the stage of chiyuv ma'aser. Rabbi Ami said we don't even need a pasuk to teach us that an adam is allowed to eat talush. Omar Adam B'Talish Lo Tarich Kra, we don't even need it. See if it says in the pasuk. No, we don't need that limud. Like a matzad, at the drosha. We have a mefurish pasuk that tells us that an adam can eat talish. Krok Siv says, when a person will be working in the karam for a person, and he can eat as much grapes as he wants. But don't put them in your vessel and take them home. That's the pasuk. So what do we see? Mustama, who says what he's doing in the karam? Maybe his job, maybe his friends are doing the picking, taking from the mechuber to the talush state, and maybe his job is to carry it out. So maybe he's being oisek in the karam of his friend with talush. It doesn't tell us. So that's mefurish. That's what the Gemara says. Ksib says ki sabo bekamra re'echa milo askimin shischoru lekatef, that his job is to carry it out. Omar Rahman lechol, he's allowed to eat. So therefore we have a mufush pasuk according to Rabbi Ami that a poil is allowed to eat from talush as long as it hasn't reached the stage of meiser. However, shor b'mechuber minolan, we now have an adam, a poil, an adam is allowed to eat from mechuber as he detaches it, or from talush, and a shor from talush. But where do we know that a shor can eat from mechuber minolan? And for the Gemara, Adam, we learn from Adam. Adam she'eno oichel b'talish. An Adam doesn't eat talish. Doesn't mean he doesn't eat talish. It means we don't have mefush or pasuk that says he can eat talish. We just said we had. We don't have it said specifically. Rashi says, four lines up at the bottom, Adam she'eno oichel b'talish. Klomar, to lo ashkachan kro behedya. It doesn't say behedya, even though that Rabbi Ami just said we found a pasuk that said that he does eat. So, however, ma adam she'eno oichel b'talush, we don't have specifically that he does, but we know that he eats mechuber, oichel b'mechuber. A shor she'oichel b'talush, we know specifically that a shor can eat b'talush. Lo sachsam shor b'disho. Disho is when it's already talush. It's just kernels being stepped on and broken open. So eno din she'oichel b'mechuber. So therefore, for sure, the shor should be able to eat mechuber. And for the Gemara, not necessarily. We have a pircha mala adam shechein atom mitzabe le'achai oso. No, maybe the reason why within adam why we see that he is allowed to eat mechuber is because we have a chiyuv to be very good to him, to help our fellow man live. But by a shor, we don't have this chiyuv. V'chei achicha imach. So therefore, maybe that we can't learn that the shor should also be able to eat from mechuber. Tomar b'shor she'iyata mitzabe be'achayoisa. In fact, we should apply achayoisa to a shor from a kavachomer from adam. V'yei shor mitzabe la'achayoisa mekavachomer. What's the kavachomer? V'ma adam she'iyata mitzabe al chasimoso. An adam, there's no chiyuv. Don't muzzle him. And if one would muzzle him, there wouldn't be any isser in it, keeping him from eating. But a shor will machbi, the Torah is machbi not to prevent him from eating. So atam is, however, with a person, you're still mitzabe la'achayoso, mitzabe la'achayoso. And a shor that it's also to muzzle him, for sure, you should have the chiyuv la'achayoso. A shor she'atam mitzabe al chasimoso, enudin she'atam mitzabe la'achayoso. And Makra, the pasuk tells us, V'chei achicha imach. No, you can't tell me that we should apply l'achayoso to the shor, because the pasuk says achecha imcha, achecha v'lo shor. That only applies to your brother and not to animals. And we'll stop here.